Thank you for joining us for 3Bs on the Law podcast, hosted by Trisha Barita, Camille Canali, and Susan Dawson. Disclaimer, this podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only, not meant to provide legal advice, and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Also, remember, laws change or they differ by jurisdiction, so this is not a substitute for seeking legal counsel in your jurisdiction on the current law applicable to you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of 3Bs on the Law. Today, I've invited one of my friends, Sally Zesut, on. She is in commercial real estate. She's fabulous, and she knows more about commercial real estate than any person I probably ever talked to. And when I asked her to come on the show, I didn't realize that we would probably need 10 episodes to get all of the information about commercial leasing out there. So today, we wanted to give you a overview of commercial leasing and what Sally does. She's with a great company called Avison Young. And so, Sally, why don't you first tell us about Avison Young, and then I'm going to have you tell us kind of what you specialize in.
Sure. Thank you, Camille. Thank you, Susan. It's a privilege and opportunity to speak with you today. And I'm really eager to impart some of my experience and knowledge working with just a wide variety of tenants through the lease process. So Avison Young is the largest privately held commercial real estate firm. We've got 5,000 employees, over 130 offices across the globe. And about 10 years ago, we were about a $40 million company. And this year, we're probably going to do about $1.5 billion. So we are growing quickly. And what's great about being privately held is that you don't report to Wall Street. So Avison Young is real estate for real impact. It's about spaces and places and where we can may have some improvements in people's lives and really help businesses thrive. And so for me, when you have a hand in someone else's success and you're able to create that bond, nothing could be more rewarding than that. So thank you.
And so if I understand, you represent mainly in representing tenants is kind of your specialty within the business.
Yes. So I am based in Los Angeles, and I help business owners buy, sell, and lease commercial real estate across the U.S. So I help companies structure and negotiate leases. We also have a full range of advisory services in addition to the transactions, consulting, location strategy. And we also have a proprietary software that we use. It's called Avant, where we use data and analytics to really help let the data drive a tenant's strategic decision, to help them get more informed about why they should look at this particular location and why it would be a benefit for their business. And for me, we have some marquee clients, but we also, my bread and butter is really working with the small to mid-sized companies. And that's what's really most rewarding for me.
That's great. So what are some of the first steps, when a business is saying, okay, I think it's time for us to either upgrade in our space, or maybe it's their very first time.
Mm-hmm.
They, like so many businesses, they've been virtual for the last 2 years, and now it's time to go back out there and get a space. So what are those first steps that they should know before calling you up, Sally, or working with you?
So really, the first step with working with me would be to schedule an opportunity call. And what that does is allows us to have an interaction and really have a needs assessment call. So every tenant has a story, and I want to know what's yours. I want to know what are some of the problems that you have. What is it that you're looking to achieve with your space? And really, what are your goals? So, in addition to that, we really want to understand the culture of your company, because that really becomes your brand and your authenticity. And within that is understanding your values and your attitudes and some of the demographics that you have in your space. Because right now, companies could have up to 6 generations of employees. So really trying to understand that, and then also how you're going to use your space. And are you going to have visitors that are going to be coming in? And what kind of flexibility do you need? And then lastly, it's, location, location, location. So the area is important, but do you need to be close to your clients? Is it going to be convenient for your staff? What kind of tenant mix do you need to have? So for, a law firm, maybe you want to be close to somebody who's got a CPA, but if you're in retail and you're a nail salon, you don't want to necessarily be in a center where there's next to a nail salons where you kind of cannibalize your business. So really that opportunity call and really kind of defining that needs assessment and figuring out what the goals that you're trying to achieve would be the first step.
So what are some of the trends? I know when we kind of had our pre-podcast call, you were talking about, and it was fascinating to me, kind of what the current trends are that you're seeing and what people are looking for in office space.
So I think firstly, the death of the office is greatly exaggerated, but I think that employers have a new obligation, and that is if you're going to be asking your employees to come back to the office, you've got to justify why. Because before the pandemic, people had to put their kids in daycare. They had to put their dog in daycare. They had to get in their car. They were driving to the office. They were paying to park. They were paying for lunch. And there was all that friction that was pre-pandemic that really was just kind of part of life. But now, 2 years later, we've been able to live a different lifestyle. So we really need to make sure that we're doing our employees a service and make them want to come back to the office and create a culture that really just makes people want to come back. So I think that it's our responsibility to really use the office as a place to convene.
I love that you said that, because I always tell people at the beginning of the pandemic, my dogs acted like I was interrupting their daily nap schedule and flow around the house. And now I leave to go to work and they look like I'm going to be turned into child services for doggies. So I love that you brought that up. So anyway, we digress.
Right. Yeah. Well, here's me thinking, I still send my dogs to daycare. Was I supposed to stop during the pandemic? Wait a second. Anyway, some of the things that I find, so as an attorney, we represent same type of businesses that you do. I work with, my clients as they're going through that lease negotiation. But when it comes to me, I get this really long, dry, detailed agreement, and there's the stuff that I'm negotiating is just so legally based. But when you're walking them through a space and they're asking questions, what are some of the things that they should expect they can negotiate? What are some of the things they should have on their head that, okay, these are negotiable items? And what are some items that they should be prepared for not trying to negotiate with the landlord?
So first of all, I guess, there's different types of leases and there's different types of clauses within a lease. But I think that to keep in mind, to keep it really simple, there's no wiggle room when it comes to taxes and insurance, and that's considered an uncontrollable expense. So there's really, anything to do with state, federal, or local laws, there's really nothing. However, there are the controllable expenses where you have an opportunity to really do a deep dive at those clauses. And, some of those provisions where there's hidden costs would be in the operating expenses. So the operating expenses, which is also known as additional rent, CAM, common area charges, pass-throughs, it really varies from lease type. But some of those provisions include parking, it includes overtime air conditioning, it includes the capital expenses that the landlord will put into the building that may or may not be passed back to you. And so, for example, even a lot of business owners think, okay, well, I have a restroom in my space, and there's also a common area restroom that the landlord is going to be taking care of that, but not necessarily. So you still might be responsible for any kind of plumbing repairs and supplies that that might go wrong in that space. And I think some of the other things to look out for as you're reviewing your lease is the parking. What exclusive uses are in the project? look at your option to renew, because some people don't realize that at the expiration or the end of your lease, like that's it. So unless you have an option to renew, there may not be, you may be have to find a new space. Other things would be the rent increases and escalations, the tenant improvement allowance, which is the money that the landlord is willing to give you to renovate your space. And that could be in terms of like a flat fee or a price per square foot, and then some free rent. So I think it all depends on kind of the structure of the lease, but those are, I think, are the main things to look out for.
So Sally, you mentioned a minute ago, there's different types of commercial leases. So what are the kind of the big three?
So there's different types of leases for different kinds of real estate. So if you're office, industrial, retail, those would all be different. So a triple net lease would be something that would traditionally be associated with a retail, think restaurant, and also industrial. That's probably the most standardized lease, and it's probably in most cases the most clear cut, unless you're doing a substantial lease with maybe an institutional owner. A full service gross lease is where the landlord pays all of the expenses, and those are most commonly found with office space. The rent is is higher because it's got the expenses built in, and then you'll have something that's called a base year. There's also percentage rent, and that is rent in addition to or in lieu of your gross sales. And then I think right now another common one is a sublease agreement. So a sublease is a rental agreement between a landlord and an existing tenant, where that tenant, for whatever reason, no longer needs the space. They hold the lease on that space, and then you actually become the tenant of the tenant. So the advantage of that is that the rent can be lower, it could have a shorter term, and you could, after that term, if you may be able to go direct with the landlord. A couple of disadvantages is that if there is an option to renew, it's usually not transferable, and you're really kind of taking the space as is. So if you need to make any modifications to it, it will most likely be at your cost, because there's not going to be any kind of tenant improvement for that space.
And what are often the term of the lease? So they're usually, for example, when you rent an apartment, you usually have a year lease. That's not true normally for a commercial lease, correct?
Correct. There is no standard lease. It could be even 6 months, but that's a really good point that you bring up, Camille, because an apartment and residential leasing is completely different than a commercial real estate, broker lease. That in residential, it assumes there's a lot of protections in that lease, and it assumes that you don't really have a lot of knowledge of real estate, and it's usually a flat fee and a security deposit, where a commercial lease is, that the whole transaction is more, it assumes that you have a lot of knowledge because it's a landlord who's generating profits. It assumes that you have some knowledge of a lease process, and there's really no set contract. So it's completely different. Rent can be quoted as a flat fee. It could be quoted per square foot. The prices are just priced, the leases are just priced differently. And that's where the different types of leases play into it. And you could also have something that's called like a letter of credit and a security deposit, and different things to securitize the lease.
So, along the lines of security for the lease, you talked about letters of credit. There's also sometimes a personal guarantee that's required on a lease. What type of financial considerations does a tenant need to be aware of when they're looking into a lease? Do they need to have certain records, certain length of business? What should they expect?
So if you're a startup, you're not going to have that history, right? So the landlord is going to want some securitization for the lease, especially if they're going to be giving you free rent or giving you some money in order for you to help build out your space. So we suggest, as part of that opportunity call, would be to discuss and have you prepare 2 years of financials. Make sure you have all your, maybe 3 months of your bank statements ready. as part of the lease application, they're going to run a credit check. And if you have a bankruptcy, and if you have, those are all things to work around. But when you hire a broker exclusively to work with you, their fiduciary responsibility is to you. So the more information that you could provide that broker, then they can make the case for you and suggest some workarounds.
That's awesome. Anything else, Susan? I think we kind of covered all the big topics, and we'll have to have Sally back to talk about all these different types of leases in more detail.
You are right. We could do 10 episodes out of just this little overview that we've done today, but I think that's it for today, right?
Okay. Thank you, Sally, so much. If people want to get in touch with you, how do they do that?
They can get in touch with me via my website at avisonyoung.com, or my email address, or my telephone number is 310-971-8950. And I do want to mention to you that as a tenant rep, our services are free to your clients. So a lot of people think because that maybe we can save on the commission on a lease, or maybe they call a sign that's on the building. Well, that broker is really working for the landlord, and you just want to make sure you've got your own representation. So I only bring that up because a lot of tenants aren't aware that the contract has already been signed on the commission, and you should have your own representation and someone looking out for your own best interests. And I think that's all I'd like to say about that.
That's actually great advice, Sally. So thank you for pointing that out. It didn't occur to me, quite frankly, that the payment, it is a big deal. And I think people do assume that they're going to have to pay for that out of pocket. So thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time on 3Bs on the Law. Thank you for joining us on today's podcast of 3Bs on the Law. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast. We also welcome any comments. If you'd like to get in touch with us or suggest a future topic, you can email us at 3THREEBsonthelaw@gmail.com. And because we're lawyers, we need to remind you that this podcast is not meant to provide you with legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.